Chapter 20. Back in camp, Pat swallowed a mug of coffee in the midst of a scene of orderly confusion. Around him men rolled slickers and threw saddles on skittish ponies, clinched Titans, and made ready for the day. 2 riders rode herd on the burros bunched near the wall. At the sheriff's yell, 20 eager-eyed men packed around him. All sensed that action was near, and Pat's pulse throbbed with pride as he eyed the riders whom he was about to launch into a desperate enterprise. They were a grizzled, hard-ridden bunch. The majority had seen action in his posses in times past, and he knew their caliber. There was not a weakling in the bunch. "You saddle whoppers can slacken them clinches," he drawled, amusement in his grey eyes. "We aren't straddling ponies this trip. We're switching to donkeys bareback." "Hell!" boomed Ezra. "What'll I pack my legs? They'll drag worse than a snake's trail." "Well, take a dally on them," chuckled Pat. His voice changed, becoming intense with eagerness. "We gotta force the gap, fellers. Some of you Jaspers been through it before. It's straight and narrow and not a spot of cover. Cheyenne's bunch are holed up at the far end, priming to blast us. If we fork our ponies, ain't a Jasper will get through alive. My idea is this. We'll fork a Ginny apiece to the gap, drive the herd ahead, then we stampede through the gap, hazing the critters from the rear. They'll take the Cheyenne's lead. Everyone that goes down gives us a mite more cover. I'm gambling most will go right through and swamp Cheyenne's boys, and we'll be right on their tails. You got her?" "Damn you, Pat, for a doggone Apache," grunted Jim Moreland with a slow grin. "So that's why you gathered them blasted burros. Slickest scheme I heard in a month of Sundays." The sheriff glanced towards the ponies ground hitched around the packed group of possemen. "We'll need to leave a cavvy man behind." "Well, you're not acing me out of this fracas," growled Bill. "I've been nursing burros and chewing dust from Coyote Springs on. I'm going for the gap, yes sirree." "Well, maybe some gent would like to snaff the job?" inquired Pat. Chill silence greeted his words. He read blank defiance in every eye. "Well," he announced crisply, "I gotta pick a man. Jim, you're half crippled with that bum wing. You stay behind." "Like hell I will," roared the burly marshal. "I'm rodding this outfit." Pat's voice was steely. "There'll be action aplenty when we break through the gap. Let's get moving, boys." Despite the prospect of bloody fighting ahead, the sheriff chuckled with amusement as he watched his possemen. Winchesters slung across their backs, urging their mounts with boot and heel and voice towards the gap, hazing a motley bunch of burros ahead. Some riders doubled up their long legs and perched like oversized monkeys on the Ginny's razor backs. Others dragged their spurred boots in the dust. Many improvised hackamores with they attempted to guide their slow-plodding steeds. Some disgustedly abandoned attempts to ride and plugged afoot along the swales. Roars of laughter echoed from the beetling cliffs. It was surely the most comical cavalcade that ever traversed the grim barrens. As they drew close to the somber mouth of the gap, the sheriff's thoughts took a darker hue. What if his scheme backfired? He was staking everything on the burros going ahead. What if they refused to face the blasting fire from Cheyenne's gunmen? They might swing around in blind terror and trample the dismounted possemen beneath their sharp hooves in a frenzied stampede. When once a burro gets a notion into his head, nothing on earth will stop him. Well, thought the sheriff fanatically, the answer will be plain within the hour. He could think of no other strategic action to take. An attack without cover would be plain suicide. Possemen and burros massed behind the shoulder of the gap. 20 paces yawned the mouth of the canyon. Pat visualized Cheyenne's gang crouching behind the rock wall at the furthest end, all primed to sweep the narrow canyon with the hot lead. He gathered a small pile of dead brush, set it afire, and shook out the tarry pine knobs from the gunny sack and set the ends in the flames. Soon they were blazing furiously. "Get this straight," he said curtly to the curious riders gathering round. "We gotta get them burros through the gap, which means we gotta scare 'em worse than Cheyenne. You keep your heads low and give the critters hell. Remember, it's their lives or yours." He handed the blazing brands around, retaining one for himself. "Come on," he yelled. "Haze 'em like hell." In a mad turmoil, 21 brawling, yipping men herded the startled braying bunch of burros around the shoulder into the mouth of the canyon. Tight packed between the towering walls, the stream of jinnies flowed into the narrow canyon. Pat jerked his 6 gun and loosened a shot, touched his sputtering torch against the flank of the nearest burro. Terror-stricken, the animals leapt forward. All around, wildly yelling men were panicking the animals with torch and gun. The air reeked with the stench of burning hair and the smell of powder fumes. Headlong down the canyon raced the terrorized animals. Behind them, with flaming torches, prodding and shouting, lumbered the possemen. Strangely, not a shot rang out from the canyon's farther end. Maybe, Pat thought, plunging in the rear of the swift receding torrent of brown panting men striving to outrace him, the bandits were too overcome with amazement to do anything but stare. The onset of a band of crazed burros might have been surprising. Then a merciless blast poured from Cheyenne's barricade. Screaming lead ricocheted from the rock walls. The thunder of guns was flung from cliff to cliff, echoing and re-echoing on deafening waves. Ahead, the burros slowed, bunched and tight-packed. Again the possemen were upon them, yelling like demons, waving and thrusting their flaming brands. "Ain't this hell with a lid off?" yelled Bill as he jostled by the sheriff. "Yes, sirree." Shoulder to shoulder, the riders kicked and pushed, singeing the thick hides with their torches. Again the animals surged forward, crazy with fear. Pat stumbled over a brown carcass. Others dotted the trail of death. Better that than men, thought the sheriff grimly. A bullet zipped past his ear. To his left, a posseman spun round and dropped. Another stopped to retrieve the fallen man's torch, straightened, and was cut down. In the delirium of excitement, the attackers had thrown caution aside and were racing along upright, head and shoulders above the protective barrier of the burros. "Get down!" yelled Pat, waving frantically. Another breathless interval, a delirium of thundering guns, screaming lead, and choking dust. Suddenly, the sheriff became aware that gun flashes no longer split the gray fog ahead. The leading burros were crashing over a low rock barrier. In a flash, it seemed the canyon was empty of animals, save the grayed bodies laying thick among the talus. Pat clambered over a rude rock wall. Before him stretched a long valley, bound by barren slopes. Midway down the valley, a body of horsemen were flailing their racing ponies in a headlong flight. Fanning out in another direction were the jennies, fast slowing to their customary pattery walk. The gap was won. Sweaty, dusty, and disheveled, the victorious possemen clustered around Pat. "Never seen nothing like that in all my born days," declared a leather-faced rider. "A pack of lobos skedaddled afore a bunch of jennies. It sure sounded like a crazy notion, Pat, but by goodness, it worked." "Well, from now on," declared Bill solemnly, "I raise my hat respectful to every burro I meet up with, and I'll feed him oats, yes sirree." An hour later, Pat, with 17 eager riders behind him and Jim Moreland on his side, hit the bandit trail. One deputy had stopped a bullet square betwixt the eyes in the mad stampede. 2 had been nicked by flying lead. These last had been left behind to gather up the burros and head the herd back to Danville. The water casks were cached near the canyon. As he rode, the sheriff eyed the barren slopes on either side of the long, snaky valley, searching for Pete's first landmark, the blasted pine, where, with Sam and Ezra, he had previously swung right to the south. If, as Sally claimed, right was wrong, the real trail led northward. He had no need to consult the map. He had studied it so often that he thought sadistically it was probably engraved upon his brain. Grey and sundered, the shell of a once mighty pine caught his eye. It was set at the mouth of one of the numerous ravines that twisted down into the valley. The sheriff's pulse quickened. Now, Sally's theory was to receive the test. He neck-reined his sorrel northward, the blasted pine squarely behind. Another ravine gaped black in front of the fast-moving body of horsemen. Pat's heart leapt as they drew close. On a flat rock beside his mouth, 3 boulders were piled. 3 ducks! He ejected involuntarily. Ahead, Black Butte nuzzled at the clouds with its rugged head. 4 miles, 5 at the most, conjectured Pat, and they would pass a line drawn from Needle Rock to the butte. Would they find the mirage mine at that line? On either side, eroding cliffs walled the posse in as they pushed towards Black Butte. Ravines perforated the rock masses. What a spot for an ambush. At the thought, Pat swung around and eyed the riders close bunched at his pony's tail. He held up his arm, pulled rein, and wheeled the sorrel. "We're liable to ride into a nest of rattlesnakes at any time now," he warned, raising his voice above the champing of bits and jingling of chains. "String out, a-plenty. These rattlesnakes, they bite." Again, he spurred on, eyes searching for sign, the posse coiling like a long whip thong behind. Mostly, the pony's hooves rang upon rock, but in places wind had swept the talus dust into drifts that banked hawk-high. And here there was sign aplenty. Another pile of ducks on a ledge where a canyon was hacked through the cliff to their left caught the sheriff's ever-searching eyes. Intuition told them that this was it, that at last their goal and their quarry was close at hand. The posse drew rein as he motioned them back and swung into the canyon. The dust through which the sorrel padded told its story. 50 paces ahead, the canyon twisted. Pat pulled up, brow creased. Another gap, and no burrows to stop lead. He whirled his pony and rode back to the expectant posseman, gray wreath in the dust haze, sighed to Bill. "You fellers rest in your saddles," he directed, "and watch that canyon. We have 'em holed up." The pair walked their ponies ahead. Pat, scrutinizing the weathered walls, seamed with ledges pocked with cracks. The sheriff slid out a leather. Bill followed suit, puzzlement in his eyes. "Where are we going?" he inquired. "Up," grunted Pat, unbuckling his spurs. "Hell blazes!" ejected the squat rider. "You sure in hell are bent on making a monkey out of me." The sheriff straightened and untied his rope. "Tote your string," he directed, and then slung his coiled rope across his shoulder and walked towards the wall. Clinging to the roughened face of the cliff, the pair worked slowly upward. At first glance, the wall seemed unscalable, but the sweat-soaked climbers found handholds aplenty upon its cracked, eroding face. Breathless, with blooded fingers and bruised knees, they topped it. Bill glanced down and shuddered. "Cripes," he muttered. "If an I had eyes in the back of me head, I'd never a made her. And I'll be never getting down again unless I sprout wings, no sir." Pat was busily surveying the territory. An expanse of rock stretched before them, strewn with boulders. Southward, a long chasm showed black where the plateau had been split in some bygone cataclysm. It gradually narrowed until the rock masses pinched it out. The sheriff moved towards it, Bill dogging him. When the edge of the chasm drew close, Bill saw that it was some 40 or 50 paces wide, its walls smooth as glass. He snatched off his Stetson and dropped down and crawled to the edge. Cautiously, he peered over. Bill, stretching beside him, whistled softly. 60 feet below, on the canyon floor, men were moving leisurely around. In the shade of the furthest cliff, a row of ponies were picketed. Beside them stood a crude stone hut. Behind it showed the square mouth of a shaft hewn into the rock. With a deep drawn breath, Pat slowly backed. "My goodness," he breathed, and when they again stood erect, safe from observation, "Did you ever see a neater trap than that?" "Trap?" echoed Bill. "How in the name of creation can we blast the rats out of that hole? I reckon there's 20 hombres down there, and they all toting guns." "Oh, you'll see," promised the sheriff softly. He led the way back to the wall. "Give me your rope," he requested, and standed on the brink. Wondering, Bill slid his riata off his shoulder. Pat knotted the ends of the two ropes together and paid out the line until it touched bottom below. Enough remained to make a secure hitch around a spur of rock. "Think you can slide down that without wings?" "Well, it'll sure help a plenty," averred the stocky rider. "Well, you scramble down. Tell Jim Moreland to send up 6 active hombres. They don't need to tote Winchesters. Have 'em cover the canyon mouth with what men he has left. Tell 'em the rats are due to scurry out pronto, and I want 'em scorched. Get going." For an hour, 6 sweaty riders, Bill and the sheriff, worked like beavers, building rock piles close to the chasm's edge. Each man stacked his own pile, spaced at 20-yard increments. Finally, the sheriff was satisfied. He gathered the group and spoke briefly. "Holy rattlesnake puppies," gasped Bill. "If you don't got the doggonest idea, yes sirree." Each man stood by his pile. As Pat shouted orders, they feverishly commenced rolling boulders over the brink of the chasm into the unsuspecting bandits below. Startled shouts, curses, and shrieks of agony floated out of the depths as the rock showered down into the devastating, smashing barrage. Pat crawled to the edge and peered down. Chaos was convulsing into the canyon. There was no shelter from the pulverizing torrent save the small mine shaft. Already the hut was wrecked. Crushed bodies speckled the canyon floor. Men raced back and forth, terror-stricken eyes staring upwards at the boulders bouncing and smashing around them. A broad-shouldered fella, dodging death, Cheyenne, guessed the sheriff, vainly tried to resort order. As Pat watched, the survivors dashed wildly for the remaining ponies, flung across the animals' backs, and spurred wildly for the canyon's mouth. The crackle of Winchesters, steadily swelled into a roar, hit the sheriff's ears. His lips twisted in a bitter smile. Jim Moreland's men were doing their job. One by one, Pat's band swung down the cliff face. Bill eyed the dangling rope with a puzzled frown when the last man descended. "Say, how in the heck did you get the ropes down?" he ejected. "Well, reckon you can figure your strings donated to a worthy cause," drawled the sheriff, "unless you feel an urge to climb up there and loosen it." "Not for $1 million, declared the rider. There was no sign of the marshal and his men, although the ponies were bunched in a scant shadow of cliff. Pat led the way into the canyon, and stepping over sprawling bodies, they rounded the bend. In a litter of speckled rock, lay gray-clad bodies limp and battered. By the wrecked stone hut, half a dozen dark-skinned renegades were huddled, thoroughly cowed. Posse men grouped around, smoking and discussing the affray. Jim Moreland emerged from the shaft. "Pete weren't lying when he claimed he struck her rich," he grumbled. "That gal of his can buy out the U.S. Mint." Pat nodded towards the prisoners. "They talking any?" Moreland shook his head in disgust. "They don't know nothing, just a pack of greasers. Cheyenne was the boss, and he's over there dead." "Did you see Todd Rakestraw?" inquired Bill. Moreland jerked his head towards a mangled form. "Right there, what's left of him." He turned to the sheriff. "Well, Pat, I reckon we done cleaned up the Mirage Mine case." "Well, maybe yes, and also maybe no," mused the sheriff. He turned to Bill. "What would you say?" "Me? I ain't saying nothing," declared the worthy hastily. "No siree." End of chapter 20.